Okay, so
I can just zoom in.
Zoom.
Zooming in.
that was just part of, we have
One?
to show the notes
Two.
to the teacher.
3, 4.
This will all be downloaded and then the teacher evaluates us, and this is how pathetic we were. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for being here. We'll try not to take too much of your time. This won't take long at all, in fact. For the speech class this week, what we're doing is visual aids. And so my visual aids this week are, believe it or not, this car and a chart, which is really just a piece of paper there that I have. So what I'm going to be speaking about is crash investigation. We do know that the least credible evidence that we have at a crash scene are actually the witnesses, the people involved. And that's just simply because people, when things happen so fast, they look at things through a frame of reference, and it can be so different from what we actually find. Yes, we take those statements because people absolutely believe that that's what happened, and sometimes they're right, but many times they're not. And so what this is about is crash investigation, and I'm going to talk briefly about dynamics of the crash, so a few statistics to go along with it, and then some personal experiences to go along with that. With that being said, I'm going to just jump right into dynamics. For dynamics, believe it or not, many crashes are solved in our office with little tiny toys, and it's really just a matter of putting together and understanding physics, and a few of the things that we talk about are centripetal forces. Dynamics involve all kinds of different things like angles of momentum, angles of departure, thrust angles, and all of this can be replicated through small toys in an office environment. When we have the measurements from the scene, when we've taken that information, we can take it into an office, and we'll use small toys and to figure out how the forces came together. Why is this important? Well, it's important to understand that in crashes, we care about what happened once the crash occurs, once the impact happens. But what we really are concerned about is what happened just before that. What caused it? And obviously that causation leads to civil liabilities, and it can turn somebody's life upside down with the costs that can be involved. So, with dynamics, the first thing I'm going to talk about is what we call centripetal force. Centripetal force is similar to centrifugal force, but it's different in that it goes from the center of mass, which on this vehicle would be pretty much right in the center, and it moves outward. Why is this important in crashes? Well, with centripetal force, if your center of mass is moving one direction or the other, we can determine where the vehicle was to begin with just based off of centripetal force being put into the equation. Another, there's 3 different laws of motion that Isaac Newton came up with, and I actually had to go to 3 different places to find the most easy terms for these motions, and because they're really complex when you read their actual definition. The first one being this came from the physics classroom, and its first law states that an object will stay at rest or in motion until acted on by another force. And again, in crash, why is that important? Well, if your vehicle's traveling straight down the road and something forces it in a different direction, that's going to tell us that there was another force acting upon it. Generally another vehicle, could be an animal, could be something else, but some other force. It could be one of your own braking or your steering input. So that's your first law. The second law, which I found on actually Science Discovery, is the rate of change on a force or a mass is proportional to the force acting upon it. It sounds kind of confusing, but really what it comes down to is if you could actually have 2 different vehicles, a large truck and a smaller car. The force or energy that's going to be required to move that is going to depend on the mass that's coming at it. How that makes sense to you, or what that can tell us in crash, is that you could have a smaller car move a larger vehicle, because with more energy, speed, you could have more mass. So if we see an instance where a smaller vehicle has moved a larger vehicle, and I go back to a crash that some of us are familiar with a motorcycle that hit a car out on Brooks here last summer. That motorcycle moved the car. So what did that tell us about the motorcycle? That it had to have more energy, means it had to have more speed. In that case, it was traveling over 100 miles an hour when he hit. So that is what that law tells us. Third law of motion came from UTK education. Every action, I'm sure we've all heard this, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. What that tells us is that, especially, we'll use this quite a bit on head-on collisions, where when two vehicles come together head-on, rarely do they hit 100% straight on. It's usually off to one side or the other. So what we'll look at is the action after the initial hit. And generally what you'll see is either a dipping down or a rising up, depending on the masses. And then it will actually spin one way or the other oftentimes. Not always though. The closer you get to 100% with the masses the same, the vehicles can actually come right together and stick straight together. We've seen license plates from one vehicle embedded in the vehicle that it hit. So they can hit with such a force. But what does this tell us? Well, quite often what it'll tell us is who was on the right side or the wrong side of the road. Because when this happens, quite often the movement is downward and it gouges the roadway. And when it gouges the roadway, we can line up the underside of that car with a mark on the roadway and position where that vehicle was. Not always is it so clear which vehicle was over the center line. Get this point for right now and pick up my other. Okay, just a few statistical data, information that might be interesting to people. The American Safety Council tells us that over $230 billion are lost each year in just in crashes alone. That's just astronomical when you think about it, because what does that break down to? Roughly $820 per person that we spend towards driving vehicles and the cost of crash. Why is that important? Well, that's important because it makes my job all that more important to decipher who was actually responsible. National Highway Traffic Safety Institute tells us that the leading cause still of death in the United States are car crashes. Very important again to figure out who is responsible on these acts. The biggest expense, of course, that we find isn't so often the person that dies, but this person that survives. Sometimes people will survive and have just debilitating injuries, and people are stuck paying for those folks, and those amounts can just be in the millions sometimes as to the injuries and the type of things, facilities that they have to be in after that. Sometimes being left in a vegetative state probably isn't as good as if you have just had succumbed to your injuries to begin with. Sad to say, but it's the truth. With that, just a few things from my own personal experience. Roadway analysis is everything. I go to a scene, that's what I'm looking at first. You take a real quick look at things, but what I'm looking at is the road, because oftentimes you have people walking around, they're kicking things off the side of the road, they're marking up scenes, and all of that stuff becomes very important to us, because what we're looking for is trajectory of those items, believe it or not. If two vehicles hit and the front emblem on your car goes a certain direction, well, that tells me the direction your vehicle is traveling. right at impact. Very important for determining on a crash. Sometimes it isn't as easy as it looks, believe it or not. Another thing that we look for oftentimes are biological evidence. Biological evidence being blood spatter. Unfortunately, when you hit, quite often you'll throw blood in a certain direction. Again, this tells us the direction of force that you were moving. You were moving this way, your blood goes this way. That tells us that something caused your forces to go this direction. Other biological evidence that you'll see, teeth, hair, those kinds of things. Teeth oftentimes will tell us that you weren't wearing a seatbelt, because we'll find your teeth in a dashboard, or we'll find your hair in the windshield, and these things are not possible when you're wearing a seatbelt. In conclusion, you know, it's an unfortunate thing, as I was stating, that oftentimes the ones that survive are the ones that cost the most to society. It's important for the crash investigator, because the litigation that's going to come out of that is going to be huge. And oftentimes the insurance companies will try and find ways, because this kind of sounds a little bit like voodoo science, but physics is physics. And they'll bring in people that'll say, no, our numbers add up to something different. Our numbers add up to it's their fault. And that's why it becomes important for us to show all of this, to have our numbers right, to do the math right, and to come up with a conclusion that actually, if you're not at fault, we're going to be there to help you. If you are at fault, you're at fault. That's all it comes down to. With that, thank you very much.